Sorry for that. Thank you. So for yeah, note takers. So do we have any volunteer to take notes in the Etherpad? We cannot continue until we have a couple of people volunteering. I mean, there is already some people taking notes. I mean, the chairs will also take notes, but I really need a couple of people to capture the discussions. Hello. You can just say your name in either of the chats and say that you want to do the note taking, or just go to the Etherpad and write your name. Thank you, Francesca. So we have one. Maybe someone else can help Francesca. There you go. Take this. All right. All right. Now we have 3 people. Very good. Thank you. So let's go to the Etherpad, and when the discussion happens, for those who have maybe haven't done it before, I don't know. Just remember that the important part of the discussion, not so much the presentations. Well, the presentations are kind of self-explanatory in a way. And then moving on. So the note well, here you have some of the rules that the IETF works on. It's not just about the IPR or about the legal items, but also about the best practices and the best way we can interact with each other. So being nice and polite and so on. The sessions will run on Wednesday and on Thursday. For today, we have maybe the 3 clusters, the core conf cluster, the group communications, and SNML. And then on Thursday, we will have the spillover of Wednesday, plus the core applications and some discussions that will happen on this Friday side applications meeting. And then some flex time for other material. So anybody has some comments on the agenda as it is? I see that Francesca has to leave 5 to 10 minutes early, so we'll try to be on time. Are we using, so Alexei is commenting if we are using Etherpad to record participation. Yes, there is, as I mentioned, films. At the end of the Wednesday notes, you have the blue sheets. So people are writing their names there. Few people haven't done it yet, so please do it. Moving on. So we have a new co-chair, Marco. All of you probably know him already. He has a PhD on networks and communication security. And he got a Marie Curie scholarship a few years ago for his postdoc, which is a very prestigious scholarship in Europe. And currently he's a senior researcher in the cybersecurity unit in RISE in Stockholm. And IETF-wise, I guess you have known him for a long time, in both in ACE and in core, and nowadays especially with group communication in core as well. So very warm welcome, Marco. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, all of you, also for the welcome during the past week. I'll just do my best to help this working group and the community.
Yeah, and it's kind of strange always to do these things over video conferencing. I guess ideally we should be face to face, but it couldn't happen. And then also we have, I mean, Carsten already sent an email to the main list on his 10 years in core, which is quite an achievement. Again, over video conferencing, it's kind of hard to thank him enough like this. So hopefully we will have a warm celebration when we meet again face to face. I don't know if you have something to say, Carsten, by the way. Thank you.
Finding the unmute as usual.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's really nice to sit here and see everything unfolding, and I can prepare the next working group meeting while I'm sitting here. So that's really great. So thank you for everything. And I made this slide reminding people that we do rotate chairs in the IETF. And I think there are very good reasons. People refocus on their jobs. people change their interests in other ways, or people just want to see new people coming in. And while Marco is not exactly new as a participant of the working group, he is a new chair, and I think that's very important for the IETF to have young people come in and perform leadership positions. And so, yes, thank you, Marco, for taking this on. And I have already seen your work for a month now, and I'm sure the two of you will manage the working group very well.
Thanks a lot. Speaking of rotation, we also have a new area director. Well, renew in a way. So Alexei ends his term now, and Barry will be becoming again the the area director for core, which is great also because he knows the material and can help on that too. I don't know if Alexei, you have some words as well. I think you are in the call as well. Yes, you are.
Sorry, did not expect to talk
No.
really, but I'm very glad that we have new chairs, and it seems like there is more energy in the working group, so that's good to see. And I will still be lurking around, so we'll see you around. Hopefully we'll do more reviews for you.
Thank you very much. So that ends the intro, then practicality. So we will have interim meetings to every other week starting 29th of April. They will be on specific topics. So for instance, applications is a very hot topic. The usage of resource directory with ACE in practice is also a very hot topic. So we are kind of hammering down the details for those meetings, and now it's a good time to have proposals. We haven't sent the invites. We will do that later on. Then we did a bit of cleaning of the GitHub page, the landing GitHub page. So there you should have now a bit of info on the working group material. So you have all of the slides also on GitHub and all the meeting materials, as well as in the data tracker. We also have the editors page, the issue tracker, and basically all the links together in the same place, which is kind of convenient. I already said this as well. So for the Jabber, just please use the Jabber bot when we're having discussions. So it's a virtual queue. You just do Q+ to add yourself. If not, you can do Q+ on the WebEx. And if you don't know how it works, just press help queue. Other people can add you to the queue if you don't have the Jabber. Now on working group items. So we have 2 new RFCs coming out for multipod CT and hop limit, which is great. Hop limit was, if you remember, it was also requested by another working group called DOTS. So they are using co-op for signaling, and it's great that they can use this because they had a reference to hop limit. And in fact, it might be that we have more work moving forward with them. Then we have on the editor queue, SNMLH and more units, which are pretty much done. There were a few comments on more units that sparked a discussion on SNML versioning, and you will have a glimpse at that later today. In ISU processing, we have resource directory, which by now everybody, I assume, has read multiple times, multiple versions. There were pending comments by Alexei. I think Christian has addressed them or will address them very soon. Either way, they will be discussed on the Thursday session. Maybe we don't need to comment on that right now because we are short on time. And then on stateless, there's some comments from Gennard and the security directorate, and I believe Klaus is also addressing them. I don't think there's also many remarks to be said on this, that they are moving forward. And then on post working group last call. So we have echo request tag, which basically we haven't formally closed, but so basically we need to actually do that. And I believe this version also addressed all of the comments that were raised. So we just need to close that and start with the Shepherd write-up that to send it to Barry. So I don't know, this one is pretty much done as well. And with dev URN, there were some comments on the ABNF formatting of the URN, and I think I know that the authors, from their point of view, is done. So we just need to formally start the working class call, and we can continue. So that's so much for the very mature documents, and now we can go into some other items that we have in core. My plan is, by the way, for the presenters, that I can pass the slides so that we don't need to switch slides. So you just tell me next slide, and I will do that for you, okay? So I'll mute myself, and unless there is some comments about the previous drafts, yes, you can go ahead, Availo, and present. I assume, Ivalo, are you presenting, or?
He's unmuted, but I don't hear him.
Indeed, same thing for me. If not, Alexander, maybe. Can you do the presentation or chat with?
Hi, just a question. Let me see if yeah, I'll see if Ivalo is having a problem.
We hear you well.
Yes. So normally it's Ivalo that is making the presentation. He's still here or he disconnected? Oh, he's here. Just give me a second. I think he's having some technical problem.
At the university, we are now using a conferencing system where to join a conference, you have to do an audio test first, every time. I think that's reflecting experience very well.
So
it's true, because I didn't have to do an audio test.
Yeah, it seems to work for me too. We can, I mean, so again, we are well, not short on time, but I would like to keep it on time because Cibor is right after this. So, Ivalo, can you tell us what's the status?
It's best to wait for.
Yes, go ahead.
I think he disconnected, and yeah, I cannot join him on other channel, so probably he's trying to reconnect.
Yes,
Maybe we can just wait a minute to reconnect, and if it doesn't work.
You hear me now?
yes, quietly.
Oh, okay. Let me try to improve.
If you can turn up your volume a little bit,
Yeah.
that would help.
Is it better now?
A bit.
Okay, let me turn it a little bit more. So
No, it's good. Please.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's good. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for.
Just let me know when you want to pass the slide.
Yes, sure. So I will be. My name is Ivan Petrov, and I'll be presenting the advancement in CoreConf. Next slide, please. As you might know, all the 4 drafts were in a working group last call. During that, we had quite good comments from both participants in the core working group and from NetMod. So that was very useful for the improvement of the drafts and for having a little bit wider audience that provide some feedback. So there were a number of small editorial changes and things that I believe could very easily be addressed. So for the seed draft that was in version 12, basically I have addressed maybe half of the comments already, and I plan to be addressing shortly the remaining comments. There were a few topics that I believe could be interesting for the working group to discuss in order to have the best possible outcome. So one of the questions is whether we want to be handling in any particular way the possible change of semantics in YANG files. So what is being discussed in NetMod is that maybe in the future some YANG files might change the semantic of previous revisions of the same YANG file. So whether we want in this document to have any particular handling of such situations, or we can assume that we can just allocate a new SIT range for those SIT files, for those YANG files, and have that as the solution. Is there anyone with a particular opinion on this question? If not, my intention is to state that we will be relying on additional SIT ranges to handle this, and that for now we will not add any text for this issue unless there is a strong need that is seen by anyone for this. The other concern was about the early allocation. Some reviewers noted that it's a little bit difficult to understand, and others say that maybe it's not exactly in the spirit of early allocation as in the RFC where early allocation is described. It is mentioned that it's for documents that are going to be RFCs, and here we are not mandating this. We are requiring only expert review state of the document. So what I have discussed with some of the other authors and document shepherd was that maybe we just need to improve a little bit the wording here and say that it's exactly as early, it would work exactly as early allocation, but it will be acceptable for expert review points. I mean, points that are allocated through expert review. So the intention is to have that reworded in this way. Are there some concerns about this? Is there anyone that thinks could help with particular text? Otherwise, I will try to write it in the best way I can.
So Carsten Bormann, the intention is that we are doing the same things we would be doing in the early allocation process, where that name is actually reserved to for a process that goes through the ISG and allows you to allocate code points controlled by the ISG. And we would essentially have the designated expert ask the same kinds of questions that otherwise the ISG would be asking when doing early allocation. Is that a correct representation of where we're heading to?
Yes, that's my intention.
Yeah, so we probably need a little bit of text because the early allocation RFC, the number of which I forget, of course, is very much oriented towards an ISG-based process. And of course, the designated expert doesn't operate exactly in the same way the ISG does. So I think we may have to write some text there to explain how this is done.
Okay.
Yes, there was also, sorry to interrupt. There was also the feedback, I think, from that an expert review typically is very fast, so you can expect like in maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks your allocation decision. So you don't need, in fact, an early allocation anymore because you get a quick allocation anyhow. I'm not sure if that's a valid point here, but yeah, that's also something to consider.
Yeah, is that a bug or a feature? So early allocations have the interesting property that they are reviewed after a year, and they go away if nothing happened. So by mirroring the early allocation process here, we would also be able to issue provisional allocations very quickly, and then get them back if the thing actually didn't happen, which is different from just quickly allocating things where essentially the code point is gone.
Okay, yeah, I see the intention.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the effort is worth it because SIDs aren't quite as scarce as other code points that we are doing allocation for. So I think we have to think whether we actually want this, but I was just trying to explain what we gain by having an early allocation kind of process.
Yes, thank you, Karsten. So maybe we can continue the discussion on the mailing list in order to have a little bit of time also for the other points. But yes, this is the question that we are trying to resolve, and some of the ideas where we are heading right now. Okay, so one of the reviews stated that for the registries, it could be useful to have a group of the IANA registries so that they are easier to find. Maybe we should try to find the best name for this group. I can start a discussion on the mailing list for this as well. And the remaining issues, I would say, were more minor, and I hope to be able to resolve them easily. And yes.
Before we go into Jan Sibor, then just to note for the discussion that then we will continue the discussion on the mailing list, and that is pretty mature, and that there is no major things basically to.
Yes, there were people that stated that they are pretty happy with the state of this draft, especially after the reviews are the comments are resolved. So yes, enough. Yeah, thank you. So yes, Jan Tusibor also was in working group last call. Also, a few people stated that it is ready for them to be moved forward to it. We received a few comments, and most of them are already resolved. I haven't received formal confirmation from my school, but he will for sure let me know if there are still some things that need to be resolved there. The question that arose from the answer to the comments was how exactly we want to connect the SITS specification with the Young to Sibor specification. The question is that well, we could mandate that the seats that we use in the Young to Sibor are exactly the seats that come from the SID draft, currently this is not the case. For now, we are just talking about integers that represent elements, items in the Yang file, but we don't say that they need to be provisioned in the same way they are provisioned in the seed draft. The idea has been that people might decide that they want something else in the future, and it's the comma draft that actually links the things together. The question is that if someone wants to use the Yang to CBOR draft, let's say to do RESTconf, then they need to have a separate specification that describes this, whereas if we had in a way recommended the use of seeds from the seed specification in the Yang to CBOR document, and we declare content formats, that could be possible without additional specification. So that's the question, whether we want to have that link, that normative reference from the Yang to CBOR, or maybe the other way around, from the seed draft to the Yang to CBOR, in order to have this facility, this ease of use of the two drafts together in other circumstances. Do you want to discuss this now, or maybe we can continue on the mailing list? I don't know.
Well, I mean, you have to submit another version of it one way or another, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know if people have opinion on the addition of normative references, but I would say probably not a strong opinion right now. It doesn't seem so. Maybe you do. Okay.
I have a very strong opinion on normative references because I was chair of this working group when we had to wait for a year for RFC 725 to be published because we had a normative reference that we shouldn't really have had. And then right now I have a document in the RFC editor queue that is sitting there for 140 weeks, which is almost 3 years now, because we have a normative reference that we probably shouldn't have had. So even if it looks all very obviously and great at the time you submit things, it's really worth thinking about which normative references you want to have in a document. And since basically Yang CBOR is a freestanding document, of course it sits on the shoulders of Yang, but it doesn't really need all the other machinery that we are creating here. I think it would be best to process this with the smallest amount of normative references we can have. And we have to balance that desire with something that Jürgen said, which is that it's probably a good idea to make the document also freestanding in the sense that somebody who just wants to use Yang CBOR can reference it and doesn't have to reference all the other documents just to get little things like media type definitions and so on and so on. So that's essentially the core of the discussion that is going on in the mailing list right now. And I think it would be good if people chimed in and discussed how to best handle these 4 documents in such a way that we minimize the amount of getting things stuck just because they happen to have the wrong direction of the normative reference arrow.
Yes, that's a very nice summary. Thank you, Karsten. So yes.
Well, in addition to this, by the way, did you actually reply to Tom Page and the feedback he gave on this one? By the way, it was pretty extensive as well.
On this one, I might have missed that. I know he had something on Komai and something on Yank Library. So
sorry, is Tom? Let me say Petch, P-E-T-C-H. Yeah, C-H. He's on the mailing list, anyways. I'm just saying it so that we make sure that in the next iteration, when you submit that all of the comments are addressed, so that we don't need to do any more resubmissions.
Yeah, sure. I will try to find this email and contact you if I have some issues with that and handle the comments. Thank you for this point. Okay, so I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so for the COMI draft, it was also in working group last call. We had also some people stating that they believe it's all good. We had a question here. Well, we had a few questions. One was, well, what is exactly CoreConf? Why it's the complete cluster, whereas elsewhere it is just the protocol, like RESTconf, it's just the protocol in the same way that we have COMI here and not the complete cluster. So there was some confusion around this, and it came pretty much from anyone that commented on this draft and even some of the other drafts. So one maybe simple solution would be at least to include CoreConf in the title or in the abstract at least of this document, so that it's much more clear how everything relates together. If you have some other opinion, do let us know. Otherwise, we are going to progress in this direction. And the other part was how we want to actually handle the security considerations. For sure, one point that could be possible to do is add some references to OSCORE. I think it's missing right now. And possibly to some other things like ACE, but I'm not exactly sure whether we want to add references in the security considerations in for ACE documents. My concern is whether that might slow this specification down, whether this is something that is really needed, or we can just generally state that people need to take care of authorization in one way or another. Maybe it also depends how this will be worded in order to not become a blocking point that keeps this document in the RFC queue for a long time. So, any comments so far? Okay, and next slide, please. So the last draft from the cluster is Yank Library. We still had, it was still in working group last call. We had some positive reviews and some reviews that asked for some more clarifications. I believe I answered just before the meeting the comments from Tom Page. For sure he might have others, because in his comment he said that he didn't get in that into the draft, so we might have some more discussions there, but the only other part that I'm aware of is, again, considering the security considerations. And I believe if we just link it to the COMI draft, that will be a good way forward. It is, I believe, how it was handled in the Young module library RFC. So my intention is to do the same here. If anyone has ideas or concerns with this, please let me know. So I assume that there are no comments.
Right.
Yes?
So actually, the comment on Tom page was on this document. Sorry for the
Okay.
confusion.
Yes.
So I guess we should. Well, you will be doing a resubmission of this one as well.
Yes.
Do you have a timeline for all, because it's few documents, so do you have a timeline for the resubmissions?
So I believe I should have a new, I mean, I will have all the editorial changes in maybe by tomorrow, towards by the end of the week, and then it depends if some discussions need to be handled in more details. It might take a little bit more time, for example, for seat draft, writing down the part about early allocation might take a little bit of time, but in any case, my intention is to try to have a new version by the end of next week. I don't want to have very long time before the next version.
Very good. So then in that case, it would be good if you try to reach out to other potential reviewers that you think could be should be aware of this, that you haven't reached already, and send them that latest version. And other than that, I guess we can, because we haven't formally closed the working group last call on this one, so we can just do another one once the new documents are submitted. Is that a good idea? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds good to me. Thanks.
Okay, so anybody else? We're a bit behind schedule, so it might be. I'm already saying it. Warning that we might have to move some documents to Thursday next week. Anybody else has comments on the CoreConf cluster? Right. So then let's move on to group communication. Well, the timeline was there. Sorry. Okay. Very good. Group communication and Esco, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I'll now present the group communication BIS drafts, an update for Rate Communication Protocol group communication. You can move to the next slide, please. So the goal was to remind you is intended to be the normative successor of the RFC 7390, which we had experimental for a while. So we want to obsolete that one, include all the content, also update it with the latest insights, and then have a standard track document. And this document can be used as a standard reference for implementations. And what we have in scope is really a group communication over, can be secured using OSCORE or unsecured, and also including the call protocol and any recent developments that might impact group communication. For example, observe, clockwise is there. Security is a clear one. Maybe also the new methods that we have. And as the use cases are now moved to the appendix, they are also included as a reference. You can go to the next slide. So the process view of what we did. We have updated it with reviewers' comments, so that's both from Jim and Thomas. Thank you. Meanwhile, it also has been adopted now as core working group document. It's also now uploaded and available, 0 version. And next I will talk about the topics, basically, that we made changes on. That's on the next slide. So the content view, what has seen quite a bit of change is the definition section. There's a new section there that defines application groups, co-op groups, and security groups, including 2 new figures. There's also the concept of group discovery is now added in section 223. It refers to the resource directory. It can be used for that. There's also an ACE security section that got some comments, is now rewritten. It's the one countering attacks, also with more details on what to actually do to counter the attacks. There are many other fixes and clarifications. For example, the description of what RFCs are obsoleted and updated is now improved. Okay, go to the next. So this figure here shows one example of the group concepts. If you look in the draft, there will be also the more generic model. So the types of groups are shown here. Yeah, the scope group, which is typically consisting of a multicast address and a specific port used by that group. It can be linked to OSCORE core group to provide security. And within that combination, you can also have one or more application groups. So you can think of, for example, indicating an application group on the right path as shown here. So there's a lights 1 and lights 2. These are 2 different application groups that drive, for example, different lights, but that reuse the multicast group and the port and the security relation. You can also have a 1-to-1-to-1 relation here. But this is now better explained in the draft as well, how this relation is. Okay. No questions, we can move to the next. Yeah, we still have open issues in the draft. So we have a new issues page in GitHub, the core working group repository. There's also still the previous page from GitLab. Yeah, so this number 1 shown here is from the GitHub issues page. Based on the email thread, there was some discussion about what is exactly the multicast endpoint concept, and can the server actually change the UDP port in response? So that's shown in figures schematically. There's a client sending co-op request from a specific UDP port to a destination, and that's multicast. So what the server does here, it receives it at one endpoint, and then internally it delegates the request to another endpoint. The one that answers here, set 5683. That one responds with co-op response in this case. So the client doesn't really look at that port number because by the earlier rules in RFC 7252, it already knows I should only match on the token value, so not on the endpoint in this case, because it's not. Still, there was some discussion on the mailing list because some people thought that it's counterintuitive that the server would actually change the endpoint or delegate internally to another endpoint. So I don't think that's fully concluded yet. But that's one of the open issues. And what we want to do is actually clarify this model. So how that the port can change. If we all agree to that, that's okay. Also maybe give some reasons why you want to do that. All right, so we can maybe move to the next one. Yeah, these 2 issues are from the previous issue tracker from GitLab. So there was a comment coming from Thomas about using URI host for naming application groups. That's something we have to also clarify maybe a bit more in the text. So would it be advisable to use URI host for that to identify an application group or not? There's one issue with the URI host option is that you cannot extract that typically from a URI, because if you give a regular co-op URI and you parse it into the options, then by the default parsing, the URI host gets taken out, so you get the shortest possible co-op message. To use that option, you have to, after the URI parsing, you have to somehow put it in again, find some reliable way to put it in to indicate the application group. that's an issue. We also are happy to take more comments on that, of course. And the second issue is about response suppression. So we talk about the suppression of responses already. So there is the no response option, for example, that you can use, or you can configure it on server side. It's still open question whether that should operate on a response code class or not. So you can basically define it for response codes individually, for example, to suppress or not, but you can also define it for whole class. So that's still an open issue to be discussed. The authors will also first internally debate about that, see if we can get to a solution. Okay. Then the next steps is work on these issues, obviously, and process the latest review comments that came in after this draft was published, the version 3. We also want, on the slightly longer term, to test the selected functions in co-op implementations. One example is the extension of the observe RFC with multicast usage. That's described in our draft here, and I heard that first tests were already done successfully with Californium to do that. It seems one of the straightforward things. And of course, yeah, any other things we need to test in implementations, we also need to do that. Okay, so still have some work ahead of us, and I think this concludes the presentation. Let me know if there are any questions.
Esko, very quickly, just to clarify, you mentioned the issues 1 on GroupCom Bs and 7 and 27 on the OSCOR GroupCom. The issue 35, where is that one?
Yeah, so it was these issues were on also draft GroupCom Bs, but on the non-working group adopted version. I think there's a link also in the presentation, which takes you to the issue tracker page where you can see the issues.
All right, okay.
It's not on OSCOR group communication, but on the GroupCom Bis draft.
Another comment, you mentioned in your presentation also that you have gotten reviews by Thomas and Jim, right? Is that sufficient? Would you need more reviewers?
Yeah, I think it's always good to have more reviewers, of course. I'm not sure at what stage you would like useful. Maybe the next update, for example, we can take more reviewers then. So yeah, always welcome, I would say, to have more reviews.
We could do a quick call for reviews. I mean, anybody wants to volunteer? You can mention it in the Jabber or in the WebEx.
Yeah, it could be for the current version or the next. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, we have Thomas here for the next version. Thank you.
Yeah, so we have 3. Well, so in addition to Thomas and Jim, who will review again, we have Christian. I see that we don't have, I don't know if people are not using the queue for some reason or if there is no more comments. If hearing none in particular, let's move to the next topic.
Okay.
Thank you. Let's go.
Thank you.
So we start with OSCOR GroupCom. So Marco, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Marco Tioca here. This is an update on the Group OSCOR document. Next slide, please. Yes, we have just submitted version 8, and it's the second update since the Singapore meeting, actually. Mostly addressing 2 reviews from Jim, 1 from Christian. Thanks a lot about that. Some points are still open. I'll mention them in this presentation. Next slide, please. So just a quick highlight of the main updates already incorporated in version 8. We improved pretty much rules about processing of messages, both requests and responses, and especially across group rekeying. So in case the response is protected with a new context different from the one used for the request, the server has to use its own sender sequence number, also included as partial ID. We also detailed the support for observation in line for the different message processing as the OSCORE RFC does. And we have also more security considerations, especially not recommending using the group keying material to send a unicast message, which can be the case actually as a need in case the echo option is used or blockwise transfer is used. And we have kind of solved the problem introducing some more content in this document. I'm coming to that. Next slide, please. So in particular, we have defined additional modes of operation of OSCORE. We have always had the signature mode. If this mode is used for a message, either request or response, the message is signed and it's encrypted with group keying material. We have introduced an optimized mode. If it is used for a request, the request is signed, it's encrypted with group keying material, but the MAC is removed to save space in the message. A response instead is not signed because it's encrypted with pairwise keying material derived locally by the 2 exact endpoints exchanging a message via unicast. And the pairwise mode instead considers both for request and response, no signature, encryption, and authentication with derived pairwise keying material. And when it comes about using pairwise keying material, well, you can do that and it can be convenient in use cases where you don't have intermediaries, for instance, for verifying signatures, like gateways. Next slide, please. And as to the actual pairwise keys, they are derived using the same construction adopted in OSCORE, starting from the sender key of the sender device and a static Diffie-Hellman shared secret, which is in turn computed out of the asymmetric keys of the 2 exact devices. And this is compatible for ECDSA and EDDSA. We are signaling this so that the message is in particular protected with pairwise keying material, setting one of the yet unused bit in the flag byte of the OSCORE option that we are now defining and reserving for this. Next slide, please. So I have now a list of open points we plan to address for the next update. I'll give an overview. We plan to open issues on GitHub. Please comment, especially if you have concerns about the way we propose to address them. So out of the reviews emerged that we should be more clear in what to do with the sender sequence number of a node after a group rekeying occurs. There are pros and cons with both approaches. We would prefer to not reset the sender sequence number, just keep it growing, at least as default behavior. But of course, application policies on a particular node can just override this and instead reset it to 0. That was one point. On the optimized mode in particular, we had concerns from Jim and Christian, focused in particular on the optimized request and on the fact that the MAC is taken out. So all considering that instead the pairwise mode seemed to be fairly well accepted, we have this in mind. We can forget about the optimized mode as a mode as such, keep instead the content about the optimized request for more thoughts on the raised issues, and move the optimized requests as an appendix in the document. Instead, we can move the pairwise mode up to the document body. Next slide, please. Okay, of course, we need to say something normative now about what to do with these modes and how to support them. We want, of course, to have as a must to be supported a signature mode. The pairwise mode can, in general, may to be supported, but we think it must be supported if echo and or blockwise, they're independent, they are supported by a node, because they would make it possible to solve security issues you would have otherwise using the group key material. But then practically it's up to the single application and its policies, rules, or exact resource that it's trying to access to decide how to exactly protect a particular message with which particular mode. Next, we also want to clarify, I didn't mean next slide, sorry, next point. Thanks. We also want to clarify better about the pairwise mode, because it's this one. Previous one. Previous slide. Thank you. This one. We want to clarify a bit better about the nature of the pairwise mode, because, yeah, it's a mode of group or score, of course. But if you are willing to pay the price of having essentially a group manager deployed, this may be convenient in other setups where you're not interested in having messages over multicast, only one-to-one, but this can be helpful for the sake of key management. In fact, the node can just run on the wire a single establishment with a group manager, and then following local derivation, it can produce the key material needed for one-to-one communication with other devices. So we think this is something to clarify when introducing the pairwise mode, but it remains anyway a mode of group or score. Next slide, please. Yeah, of course, we think of introducing a group policies just to signal the fact that a group uses and supports the pairwise mode too. Christian wondered about the flag bit in particular, if it has any other meaning than signaling this usage, and not that we can think. It was really thought of having group or score in mind. But Christian proposed also to flip the way we use the value of that bit right now. So he's proposing to have it set to 0 to indicate, in fact, that the message is protected with pairwise key material. That's, in a sense, what happens in OSCORE2, where the bit has value 0, while instead setting the bit to 1 to signal the message is protected in signature mode. And this, of course, requires very doable changes in current implementations. Next slide, please. We need to say something, of course, about error handling. It seems doable to say something especially about the server side. If the server receives a request protected in pairwise mode and the server doesn't support that mode, should just respond with an error, possibly indicating some diagnostic information to help the client. And Jim, in one of his reviews, also raised the possible concern in case of observations. In particular, in case the same client and server are running two same observations, but on different group contexts. This may be a problem that will require the server to include the group identifier in each response. I think we need to think a bit more about this, and if this is really an issue, because the different observations are bound to different token values. And they play a role in retrieving the security context also on the client when getting a response. So it may not be an issue, actually, but we need to think more of this. Next slide, please. Final slide on open points. We have different opinions from Christian and Jim about an appendix section describing one of the approaches for the server to synchronize back with the sequence number of clients based on a first trusted request whose sequence number is taken as baseline by the server, essentially. So Christian proposes to also take and process the request as such, while Jim believes it's actually vital to just take its sequence number as baseline, yes, but then discard that request. So we have different opinions, and this definitely deserves more discussion, starting from the GitHub issue we create. easier things. We got some text from Christian, thanks, for the appendix related to the pairwise mode, where we describe a very general, simple discovery mechanisms to the benefit of the client to find out servers in the group and information related to them, to talk to them using the pairwise mode. And this is in particular for their IP address. We think that text cover pretty well this need, but feedback are of course welcome if anything is missing. We need to add more text now to make it possible also for group members that are only silent servers to support the pairwise mode and use it, because of course they would also need now to provide a public key to the group manager and possibly have a KID as identifier of that public key. This will have side effects that we can totally handle also on the ACE draft, taking care of the key management in ACE. We will also remove the IANA registers we created here long ago, because now it seems to be time to point to the new updated COSI registries. And we think of having a new appendix describing a bit more, other than sequence number synchronization, what a device should do in case of reboot, essentially. Next slide, please. Yeah, we plan to work on these open points from the previous reviews and the latest review from Jim we got already on version 8, thanks a lot. Test message protection using the pairwise mode that we are working on implementing. And we think once all this is done, of course, we can consider moving forward to working group last call.
Very good. So we have some comments in the queue. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, number of issues. So let's just start by going back a slide or two. Am I making noise?
It's okay.
Okay.
Sorry, could you repeat, Jim? You said to go back a couple of slides.
Okay, that's good. No. I'll go forward. Right. So regarding baseline synchronization, I said it should be optional to process the first message, not mandatory to drop it. But I believe you should be able to drop it.
Okay.
Okay. Regarding the pairwise, I'm having problems saying that EDDSA should be the mandatory to implement, and pairwise is mandatory to implement, because that basically says I need two completely separate implementations of EDDSA on my hardware. One for Montgomery and one for Edwards. I don't think that's very kind.
Right.
I'm sure there were some other things that I wanted to talk about, but I'll let Christian go in.
Sorry, can you say that again, Jim?
Which one?
The second one. The second one. It's saying
Uh,
mandatory to implement and.
Right. If you do EDDSA, you have to do both a Montgomery implementation and an Edwards implementation, because the key agreement and the signature modes use different curves and different math.
Christian?
On the same topic of the E2 appendix, I think that we should be just careful to differentiate here between in which situations a client may be at leisure to reply to request when it doesn't know precise freshness, and the cases where the client uses the sender's sequence number to return on that sequence number and have different strictness in there, because for that, this is where it gets hard cryptographically, whereas the other thing is just a matter of freshness and do you believe that this request is fresh enough for the application to process. Those should be kept apart in those.
Thank you.
Maybe Michael and Jim, you wanna the discussion you're having in the Jabber, you maybe wanna have it in the call as well for everybody.
Know that I understand the question well enough to ask it.
Well, in terms of doing Edward's signatures, there's a draft coming out of LWIG, which talks about the EDDSA in with the mapped coordinates where you can do both encryption and signing, both the key agreement and the signing. So that could become the mandatory to implement rather than generic EDDSA.
That would be great.
Maybe can somebody put the link to the draft on the Etherpad for all of us to check out later?
I'll find it and do that.
So Marco is telling me that we are 22 minutes behind. So if that's okay, unless there is further comments, let's move on.
I have one comment.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Francesca. This is not about the draft, but there has been a discussion in the mailing list about making this document update OSCORE. But because OSCORE right now, if you have been following that discussion, only allows HMAC-based HKDF to be used for key derivation. And there was some discussion about why was that? And there was no real reason why only HMAC-based HKDF are used. So we wanted to fix that and say that all KDF registered in COSI can be used. And John suggested that we would do that in this draft, so in this document, and that will mean that we have a sentence saying all KDF specify or registered in COSI can be used for OSCORE, and that will mean that this document updates OSCORE. And I agree that we need to do that. We need to make this fix for KDF, but I'm not sure that doing it in this document is the best option, because like I would like to do it the fastest way possible, obviously, but if you do it in this document, then there's going to be a link where it says that group OSCORE updates OSCORE, and that might give the wrong impression to implementers that they need to implement group OSCORE if they have OSCORE, even though it's definitely not the way it is. I don't know if that was clear.
I think so. I think it's clear. Maybe at this point, so this sounds to me like some discussion that needs to take place among the authors. These details, right?
It's more about if the working group has opinions. And,
yeah.
I'm
assuming that the opinion. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to put that out right now that I agree this change needs to be made, but I'm not sure that we want to make it in this document. Yeah.
I mean, I'm assuming that the authors of Group Command OSCORE will be the ones having well-versed opinions. To me, it's a bit like what Michael Richardson was saying, that I don't know enough about cryptography to be able to have an opinion, and I guess for the rest of the group is similar. Regarding the reference, maybe we can move it. We can check it a bit later. We are not. Sure. It's not urgent, I would say, at this point. So, my other thoughts were that for this draft, I guess we were looking for reviewers, right, Marco?
Yes, doesn't hurt.
Doesn't hurt, as always, yes. So if anybody wants to review now, please say so. You can say it in the Jabber. Just do +1, and we will add it to the minutes. While you think about whether you want to review and write +1 in the Jabber, let's move to the next presentation.
I think that would be me.
Yes.
Yeah. So hello, this is Christian Amsus, and I'd like to give you a short rundown on what has changed on OSCORE Discovery. Now, to recap, this is next slide, please. The goal of what we're doing here is to allow devices to join a group communication network with a very limited set of information about the group because some of that information might not even be there by the time they are commissioned. So they might not know where their group manager is, sorry, what IP they'll be running on, etc. So the minimum information they'll have is one of those data pieces, whether it's the join resource, but more typically it would be the application name of the group. The point where we'd like to store that information and make it available to the device is the resource directory, because that has the nice advantage of allowing the devices to observe where they can join even before the group manager has arrived on the network. Next slide, please. So we've received a review from Jim on the last document. Thanks for that. Most of that has been addressed. I'll come back later to what has not, or where we still want to talk about with the group. We've reshuffled a bit of text about how the registration happens and what we describe about the group manager. We've added a way of discovering the authorization server, which means that the device, when it actually comes to joining the group, can spare another round trip on the network for discovering that information, and there are now examples in Coral. Next slide, please. So here is an example of what that link looks like. This is the information in there is very similar to what the joining device would get when it eventually tries to register at the group manager's membership resource. There it would fail in its first attempt because it might not be authorized, and that information can be put right into the resource directory. Discovering it is a bit hard with resource directory as it is using link format, but as we'll later see, can be quite straightforward if Coral is used. Next slide, please. So one thing we've relaxed a lot is how application groups can relate to OSCO groups. That is, that could be more than any in one or the other direction. And I think this is something where we still haven't achieved perfect alignment between all the documents that use group terminology. So we might want to sit down again and look into what do we mean by application group, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page here. If you remember from the last presentation on this, there was a bit of confusion about, maybe the last before, about what we mean by the group name, because the concept of a zeroed out group identifier was still in there. That is gone now and replaced with a term that also aligns with what is used for the ACE process of joining later. And yeah, some of the other definitions were improved. Next slide, please. If you look at this example here, that shows basically this very similar registration as we had before. So on the right side in the RD item, we see all that metadata that is there to inform the client ahead of time about which algorithms and which key parameters are used in the group, so that it doesn't need to fall back to trial and error. And it also has a link further on that describes if that resource is accessed, where can you get a token for this from an authorization server. And this is expressed as the AS URI in here, which is not something that is really particular to this document, but something that we would probably want to advertise in more general. This is not directly a link you can navigate as you click on there and then you're in a different state in your state machine, but this is a metadatum that happens to be expressed in links. So of course the URIs in there all have their usability, but not in terms of, hey, I'm on this thing and I go on to that thing, but I am on this thing and I see that it has a particular AS, and then I can use it in that way. So I think this is aligned with all of the general ideas of how Coral can be used, but I'm happy to be corrected there. Next slide, please, unless there are questions about right in here. Yeah. We do have one example in there that came across as a bit confusing. It is basically expressing something, a setup that's similar to what is done in BugNet. This example has a very interesting aspect to it. That is that the device doesn't know anything about the group at all, but it only knows the name under which it becomes a member of the network. That is the name under which it registers in the resource directory. Now, the information that this device is a member of that is a member of that group can potentially be expressed in a resource directory. It is not with the terminology that is right now in resource directory, but it could be extended that way. In the last iteration of that document, and I think even in the current one, we use we use such a mechanism without being very explicit that this is just an example mechanism that could also be used along here. So there's the open question of whether that's a piece of information that devices may want to extract from an RD in a more general context than in the context of announcing OSCOR group memberships. But that's basically up to you. So if you have more use cases about that, maybe we should pull this out. Otherwise, it might suffice to say that, and by the way, we're using a hypothetical extension to further limit the amount of information that needs to be on the device. Next slide, please. So yeah, we've asked for reviews already last time. We only got one big one so far. So I think it would help a lot if we could have a few more reviews here, and in parallel process the open issues that I've mentioned. And I think that's it from my side. Yeah, any questions?
Maybe I can comment. So on the first example of this is a registration, right? The benefit of the no, all right.
Yes, yes, this is a registration, but it would look very similar in a lookup as well.
The example of the lookup I see is this one, but the registration here. So on the payload, you identify the security group that you want to register to, right?
On the payload,
did I misunderstand?
On the payload, the group manager announces a joining resource for a particular OSCOR group.
Okay.
Along with some metadata of that joining resource, which is the key parameters, and in that case, in green, even the authorization server.
The token. So, but you need the AS needs to give you the token before, and you register with these extra parameters like the token.
Say again, please. Sorry.
So on the payload, then you specify the group that you want to register, the group that the GM wants to register the endpoint to, and the token that is being used. Right?
And the authorization server that is being used, yes.
The authorization server, sorry, yes, okay. I haven't had the privilege to reading this draft yet. I can volunteer to do one pass if nobody else does.
That would be appreciated.
Anybody in the call is interested on the RD and AS usage? Please do mention now that you want to check it out. All right, thank you. And yeah. So moving on then. Are there any other comments, by the way? Sorry for going so fast on these topics. There's a lot of material to cover. Christian, by the way, you're unmuted. If anybody has any comments, now is the time. Otherwise, we will move to multicast notifications. All right, let's move on.
So, still me, multicast notifications. Next slide, please. The motivation for this is to allow the distribution of resource updates in a situation where we have effective, and that usually means cheap, multicast. So where there is a lot of subscribers that would usually all observe a single resource and would thus have several resources currently active at the server, so that putting memory load to the server, and at the same time putting load to the putting load to the network, because responses are sent out individually. So the slide at the bottom right is what Francesca proposed at IETF 104 as one of the many ways in which PubSub could develop. And this is part of what inspired this document, and also aligns, as I think, quite well with what the PubSub does right now. So we'll come later to how this could all be orchestrated into a PubSub system, to the extent that the actual broker doesn't have to deal with individual clients anymore at all. Next slide, please. So CoAP by itself doesn't have a concept of a response that is going to multicast, so we are introducing this. The most tricky thing about it is that we now have to pick a token, and the concept we've talked already about at the last IETF is that, as always, the client is responsible for managing its the token space. In the case of group notifications, the client is the group as a whole, or the IP multicast group as a whole. An IP multicast group as a whole needs to pick some representative, and that could be the server just as well, which is in this case now picking the tokens that can be dealt out. In a very similar way, the server also needs to pick an external ID or a request ID when it does OSCO protection of the responses. So at some point in time, it needs to come up with an original request whose sequence number and sender ID can then be used later in assuring that the responses are all linked to that request. Next slide, please. So how we do this, and I'll start with the second large item here, is by introducing phantom requests. That is, we think of a request as it could have been sent by a representative with a source address's multicast address. Now, that request cannot be serialized or IP, but conceptually that request was there at some point in time. And then we distribute that phantom request or the information contained in that phantom request out to the clients. And that can happen, and here I'm coming back to the first point on the slide, this can happen either from the start, so the server knows when it creates a resource that this might potentially be observed, or the server can decide to switch to create such a request when it notices that several clients are observing a resource and they might all be collected into a multicast group. The server uses, so when a client tries to subscribe to tries to observe a resource, sorry, it receives, and that resource is available for multicast notifications, and the server doesn't really want to send out individual responses, then the server in the first place sends an error response. And that error response tells the client that, sorry, you can't directly observe that resource, but here is some information that would help you achieve the same thing. And that includes a serialization of that phantom request, which includes all the request ID data, and the client can even decrypt that and make sure that its signature is correct and so on. And it contains the multicast address, and can just as well contain a current representation of the resource, which is kind of making the response successful, but at least not in the way the client intended it to be originally. So it's still an error response. This also makes things like selecting content format much easier. Next slide, please. Since the last version of that document that has been presented, we've added a section on congestion control. This is largely picking topics that are already about, but stating that they apply now here as well. We are now a lot more explicit about how those responses are encoded. That is, there is a CBOR format that tells which details go where in the message, and there's a registry that allows extension of that and deals out the short numbers. And next slide, please. And we've also added an appendix that describes how this could be used in a larger scheme of things, where it's not necessarily a failing observation attempt that is giving the request data to the client. So in the kind of prototypical rollout, the client would request, would try to start an observation, and the server would fail that with the information on how to rather proceed in a multicast setup. But that's not always the case. So one way for the client to discover that information that is in that error response in other cases is when it does topic discovery in a PubSub broker. This topic discovery process usually means that it looks for topics by a particular description and receives a ideally Coral document back that gives metadata on that topic. And that metadata could also include all those phantom request and multicast address data that are necessary in order to get to join the multicast group and to understand the responses. Another example where this information could come from is explicitly asking the server about a token, but that's more for illustrative purposes to show that it could happen in a variety of ways, and there's not necessarily a single way of obtaining that information. Jaime, you had a question?
Oh yeah, I didn't want to interrupt. Sorry. Well, I mean, it's just I'm saying that this draft is very related to Thomas's problem draft, the error description at least, and also related to the PubSub draft. And basically, I was just thinking that if you are aware, well, the PubSub, I know you are. I don't know if you are aware of Thomas's draft for the error response.
I'm aware of Thomas's draft. It's not exactly the same topic. So the error response draft is for things that I'd call actual errors, in the sense that there is something really going wrong here. This is more like, this is not really an it's wrong. It's more yeah, kind of, but not the way you think. It would align quite well, probably, with the Coral version of the problem of co-op problem.
Nowadays, it's only Coral, I believe. Nowadays, we are using only Coral for the description of the problem.
The last problem document I read was primarily CBOR, with the suggestion of it could just as well be done in Coral as well.
Well, we have changed. I mean, Thomas can also mention if he wants, but Thomas?
Discussion is ongoing, but effectively the latest published draft is still the CBOR, pure CBOR stuff. So that's something that we should discuss, I think, next week. One of the options we have, very, very strong options. We wanted to move to coralize completely the draft. Yeah, it was an item for discussion, I think.
Yeah, we haven't. That's a good point. This is still on discussion, but let's say that there is a lot of chances, or is looking that we could go in that direction. Anyways, yes. So, but my main point is that this sounds like an interesting topic for an interim. We already don't have a scheduled one, because like these common areas between this draft, the PubSub draft and the problem description draft, I think they are touching upon each other a bit. So that was my main comment that I wanted to say in the queue.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
So we just need to schedule this basically later on. But just thank you.
So just to summarize my point here is that I don't see that there is any particular application error that would be expressed in parallel with that. You could probably, but I don't think that it will be the common case. So those can coexist. And yeah, it would be good to have a look at. Did I really say plain old Seaboard? Apologies. Next slide, please.
Didn't say it, but I thought it.
I'm not to be held responsible for the things that go on in your mind. So what else do we have here? One thing that we added as well since that -04 is how do you cancel those observations, which is inherently tricky because you don't have a good, I mean, it's a group you're sending to, you don't want to spam the back channel, so you don't have a good grip on who is in that group. And the proposal now is to have an option in there that basically communicates the server's estimation of the group size and asks the clients for feedback so that the server can update its stochastic estimation of the group size. And if that then happens to fall under a certain threshold, it can switch back to individual observations. I think that the most tricky point around here is that the mechanism we are using to get the responses back is that we ask the clients to register for the observation in a unicast way again. There's the recommendation that they do this with no response options, but in a way we're relying on side effects of something that's otherwise a safe operation. Now we are implementing observation, so the fact of registering an observation is something that inherently has some side effects, but so in the essence, I think that this is viable, but if there are concerns about doing things that should not be done in a get handler, now would be a good time to raise them. Next slide, please.
Is that the right one?
Yes, I'm just trying to understand Carsten's comment. I think this sampling the receivers probabilistically is just what we are doing, is it not?
Yeah, maybe I don't understand what you're doing. So in reliable multicast protocols, we often have the problem that somebody is sending out stuff and really has no idea what the audience thinks about that. It's a little bit like the many video conferences we're in these days. And so the idea is to have something like a hash value or something that the sender sends that essentially selects a small subgroup to send a response, like a reobserve or something like that. So you essentially need to maintain something like a group size estimate at the group head, at the side where you are sending to the group. And based on that, you can choose the size of that sample.
So that's pretty much what we're doing. The only thing we do differently, and we might just take your input and use that to make it better, is that we're describing it in terms of generating a random event. So we say that if I think I have 1,000 observers and I want to get 10 responses, then I send 100 out, and everyone tosses a coin between 0 and 100. And if that coin toss comes up with a 0, then they respond. And statistically, I get back those 10 responses that allow me to maintain that estimation of 1,000. If we make that on properties of the client, then we go a bit more soft on their random number generators. But
that's good.
Yeah. So next steps here are that we'd like to spend some more time thinking about the way we express the phantom request and the possible initial response to the phantom request, which we both transport in the error message. There are a few proposals around, and if you look through the document, you probably, I think they are. Marco, do you know off your head whether we have them in the very latest version?
No, it's still open to discussion according to the slide.
Okay. So, but the question is, do we want to have this in a more dissected way in Coral, versus do we just take the co-op message and put it into a binary field? So this is one of the open questions, and the other is the topic of the estimations that we just talked about, where we'll just have to go through everything once again to make very sure that we can't make devices prone to any Smurf attacks, where everyone would start sending their responses to a wrong place. Next slide, please. So with that, I think this is only summarizing things that I've already said. Questions, comments?
Well, thank you, Christian, for the presentation. My comments are the same as I mentioned before already, so no need to go on that. So if no other comments are there, maybe we can move on to the group proxy. And we have about 17 minutes left. So either SNML or the new link relation draft will not be presented and will be moved to the Thursday. But I wonder if Carsten or Ari, if you prefer SNML or the REL implementation draft to be presented. Which one would you prefer? There's two single drafts there, but yep.
We could do REL impl today because it's unrelated to SNML, and keep the SNML stuff together.
That's good. Those were my thoughts. So let's do then group proxy now, and we shift a bit the drafts and do the other one later. Very good. So Marco. No, Esco, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm here, so I can present this one. This is a new draft for proxy operations for call group communication. To the next, please. So the motivation of this draft was actually the analysis of group communication that we did for the draft group compis. We described there the use of proxies, but it also introduces a number of issues for group communication. In the previous RFC 7390, we more or less said, well, just don't do it, avoid it, because it has some issues. Now we want to kind of make it work, this draft. So the issues are that the clients need to be whitelisted and authenticated on the proxy, preferably, because the proxy will send out a multicast request on behalf of that client. So it's better to do that. So the client itself needs to be prepared that it may receive multiple responses to a single unicast request that is sent to the proxy. Some clients may not be prepared for that. The client may not be able to distinguish responses. So if it comes through the proxy, you cannot distinguish the response anymore based on the IP address that sends back the response. So all the responses look as if they're coming from a single device, which is the proxy. And also, so far with current definitions, the proxy also doesn't know when to stop handling responses. So when the client, for example, is not interested anymore. And yeah, you have to consider. So here there are multiple approaches for the proxy to handle the responses. So it could individually forward back to the client as defined by specification. Also, we have discussed earlier that it could be forwarded back as a single aggregated response. One data structure that contains multiple responses. Okay, now we're going into a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So what we describe here is a contribution that addresses the issues discussed. And the approach we consider is the individual forwarding back to the client, with the assumption that the proxy can do this, but only if it's explicitly configured to support this method of group communication, and it needs to support also the options that we are going to define. So clients are whitelisted on the proxy, can be authenticated by the proxy, and group score is also used here optionally as a secure the group communication. Okay, go to the next slide now. So what this defines is a new signaling protocol with two new core options. And so basically the client indicates to the proxy that it is interested to handle multiple responses because it knows that it's a multicast request going to be a multicast request. And also the time for how long the proxy should be active and collect these responses. And we also need the servers to do something. So basically the server that receives the multicasting request has to indicate its IP address in the response. So basically that's the IP address that is transferred all the way back to the client. So the client can optionally contact that server and also identify that server. Okay. Go to the next one. So this is what the proposed option looks like. It's basically uint encoded in there that contains the time, so for how long the proxy should be active collecting responses. And the presence of the option alone indicates that the client is interested to receive the multiple responses. It signals basically I'm capable of handling these multicast responses that come out of this. Okay, go to the next one. The other option is response forwarding. So this is what the server includes in the response. And it also has some space there to include the IP address where the server can be reached directly or indirectly via proxy by unicast. So it basically identifies the responding server. Okay, let's go to the next one. So the workflow is kind of let's say summarized here in some steps. So from client to proxy, we have a client that prepares the requests and selects the option value, and then unicasts the request with the option to the proxy. We'll skip the details a bit in view of time, so let's go to the next slide. We see what the proxy does here. So it identifies the client, also verifies, for example, that it's able to perform this multicast operation with the proxy. The proxy will take the timeout value and start the timer, and then multicast the request to a group of servers. I have to say here that the time is basically for normal responses. There's also possible observe notifications. These are an exception. These also need to be handled beyond the time. So basically, till the observe client state is cleared. Well, let's go to the next slide again. So we see what the server does. So the server is also signaled, hey, there is a client behind a proxy that's created this request that you're handling. It does that by detecting the presence of a multicast signaling option. And in response, the server can also include that response forwarding option in there with its own IP address. Okay, let's go to the next. The proxy then forwards all the responses back to the client individually. It will basically ignore late responses, except again for the observe notifications, which need to be passed through. And now the client can retrieve the identity of the server from this response forwarding option. And if OSCORE security is used, this identity or this identifier of the client is also protected here by OSCORE security. And after a certain number of time, when the token can be freed again, the client frees up its token. Okay, go to the next. Yeah, there's a couple of open points because since we published, we already got a review from Christian. Thanks for that. With many good points to consider. Actually, this led to proposed alternative design. So that's, you could say, a bit simpler design where the proxy only has to be aware of this multipass signaling option. It can remove it from the request. And also the proxy can add the response forwarding options to the responses so that the responses can be identified. In this case, you don't have end-to-end security for the information that is in the options because the proxy will add it and remove it again. So can arbitrarily change that. Also, the end server doesn't know that it's a proxy request. It would also be more difficult if you consider a chain of proxies. Maybe that's not really relevant, perhaps, in this multicast case. You have to see that. Another open point was that we thought about authentication of the client to the proxy using OSCORE. And in that case, you have a kind of double usage of OSCORE. There's a good question to people, okay, should we define that? Would this be appropriate in this document or maybe in another one? You basically have OSCORE from client to proxy and then also from end-to-end from client to the servers. So we have a nested usage of OSCORE possibly. Yeah, and the final question was, we have in this document only individual responses coming back from the proxy. So should we also define maybe the aggregation of responses? Since we have this document anyway, with this scope, we can also add that if we want. So it's another open question at this moment. Okay, I think that's it for the slides. Maybe there's one more. Conclusions, perhaps? Yes. So you can check the summary, and the main next step is here to address Christian's comments and also the open points. And again, feedback is of course welcome here on this approach and the direction we should take. Thank you.
Thank you. So Jim is in the queue. Go ahead, Jim.
These approaches seem to assume that there's not going to be any address mapping being done. Is that true?
What type of address mapping are you considering?
Well, if the server provides its IP address and it goes through a NAT, that address mapping would not be visible to the client.
That's right. In this case, you can, yeah, if the proxy doesn't change the address, which is the assumption here, because of the end-to-end protection, you can only use it basically to identify the different servers. I don't think you can use that address then to directly contact these because.
Mark here, the alternative approach suggested by Christian on the option would essentially solve this, because you'd be the proxy including the second option in the response based on the server address coming exactly in the response, or the NAT if there's a NAT.
That works maybe if the proxy is also the NATs, right? Not sure if there are other scenarios, perhaps. Yeah, if the client can reach the proxy, then it can also, through the proxy, perhaps contact these devices, even though the address is changed. In that case, the proxy will know basically the address that is inside the proxy, the unicast proxy request. So direct contact might not be feasible, I think, if nets are involved. But, through the proxy would be still an option.
Go ahead.
The client needs to discover in some way anyway that this particular address will be usable, and that might, and as part of that discovery process, it might discover that it can go through that proxy. So I think it's a bit premature to think about all the ways this can interact without having examples of where the multicast addresses actually come from in scenarios where there is not. One example that I'd like to provide in this context is when we are talking about co-op over different transports, then this might be the only way to multicast. So, for example, if you're having a device that is run, if your client is running in a web browser and escaping the web browser through a co-op over WebSockets tunnel, then it might ask the proxy to just look around what is there, and then it would send basically all linked local co-op devices broadcast address to that proxy, and that address would not even make sense to itself, to the client itself, but the proxy could send out a request, and the responses that come back, their addresses make sense in the context of that proxy.
Yeah, it could be even linked local addresses basically, and if you use the same proxy again, then that can be used then, right? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, guys. I see the queue is empty, and actually there won't be any time for the further presentation, so we will move them to the next Thursday. And let's put a pin on things because the CBOR session is starting right in 2 minutes. So thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you next Thursday at the same time. And we will talk about core applications and about a bit about CNML and a bit about link relations. Thank you.
Different time, I think, right? Next week?
I think, wasn't it? Good point.
Or same.
No, I think it's the same.
Same
It starts at the same time. Oh, sorry.
Just, it's shorter, 1 hour and a half.
Oh yeah, shorter one. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
But same time. Right, so see you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Can you stay a bit longer for the practicalities? Thank you.
Of course.
It's interesting to see the people disconnect now. Pew, 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 pew. Okay, so maybe
you may want to turn off the recording first.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Klaus.
Bye.
So